what happens when you just think out loud? You know, those moments when you're trying to figure something out, maybe make a decision, and the words just kind of pop out. Seems so natural, doesn't it? Almost automatic.
It really does. But according to this incredible analysis we're diving into today, that simple act, it's anything but simple. It's actually a fundamental human superpower, kind of the visible tip of this huge cognitive and social iceberg. It shapes like everything from how your own mind works to, how we build communities, handle global conflicts, even how we construct the very reality we all share.
Wow, okay. Constructing reality.
Yeah.
That's a big claim. So we're taking a deep dive into the science behind this based on some fascinating AI-driven analysis you've brought in.
That's right. The main source material for this deep dive is an AI analysis of how humans think aloud. And it draws heavily from this deeper text called The Architecture of Reality, an AI-driven analysis of externalized cognition and its power to shape the human world.
The Architecture of Reality. Okay, yeah. That title alone tells you this is way more than just, mumbling to yourself. So our mission here is to unpack this analysis, right? Pull out the really surprising bits and really get how this whole process works, how externalizing our thoughts, mostly through language, builds that bridge between our private inner worlds and the shared reality we all navigate, and how it affects your psychology, our society, even those big ethical questions popping up in the digital age.
And look, this isn't just like academic theory. Understanding how thinking out loud works helps you understand how you learn, how you connect with other people, and frankly, how you are constantly, taking part in building the world around you, whether you realize it or not.
Okay, get ready for some moments that might just change how you think about your own thoughts. All right, let's unpack this. Where do we start?
Let's start with the individual mind, sort of trace the origins of this whole thing. The analysis really highlights the work of Lev Vygotsky, a psychologist. He noticed something pretty simple, really. Young kids, especially preschoolers, talking to themselves.
Right, yeah. You see them playing or figuring something out, and they're just narrating everything, giving themselves instructions out loud.
Exactly. Vygotsky called this private speech, and he argued it wasn't just like random chatter. It was a crucial tool for self-direction, for problem solving. It's literally thinking made audible, using language on the outside to guide what's happening on the inside.
Huh. So wait, instead of thought just happening inside, and then maybe we say it, it starts outside as communication.
Yeah.
And we pull it in.
Precisely. That was Vygotsky's really radical idea. That thought doesn't just sort of spark internally out of nowhere. He believed it's actually internalized social interaction. We take the language, the tools we learn with other people, and we gradually turn them into cognitive tools for ourselves.
Wow. Okay, that's powerful. Our most private thoughts are built from, talking to others.
Yeah, and it happens in stages. Around age 2, you've got social speech, just talking to others. Then, crucially, around 3, private speech pops up, talking to yourself, using that same social language, but now to direct your own actions.
That's the transition stage, then, where the outer talk starts becoming an inner tool.
Yes, and the research the analysis cites shows kids use this private speech more when tasks get harder, which really underlines its problem-solving job. Then by around age 7, it doesn't just disappear, it goes underground. It becomes internalized into silent inner speech.
Which is what we think of as our inner monologue, right? That voice inside our head.
That's the one. But that overt, audible, talking to yourself stage peaks pretty young, like 4 or 6 years old.
So it really is the bridge.
It is. Society gives us the raw material, language, concepts, ways of thinking, and we internalize them. We build our own cognitive structure, our sense of self, our ability for complex thought using these borrowed tools. It fundamentally links the social world to our individual minds.
Okay. That's the developmental path. But what about the actual physical basis? That adult inner voice. Is it just an idea, or is there something in the brain?
Oh, not at all abstract. Neuroscience is really digging into this now. The analysis points to a really interesting recent hypothesis. It's called the body error theory, or B-bit. And it suggests something pretty surprising. That feeling of hearing a voice inside your head. It's actually a kind of sophisticated illusion.
Well, hang on. An illusion. So I'm not actually hearing myself think.
Well, not like you hear my voice right now.
What?
That suggests your brain is cleverly mixing two things. First, there's something called interoception of incipient speech. Basically, subtle muscle signals. Even when you just think words, your brain sends tiny, tiny commands to your vocal cords, your tongue, too faint to make sound, but the signals are there.
Okay, like the feeling of getting ready to speak.
Exactly. And second, there's audition of nonverbal sounds.
Yeah.
Your ears are always picking up faint stuff, your breathing, maybe some background noise, even internal body sounds.
Right, and the theory is the brain blends that feeling of starting to speak with those real but faint background sounds.
Precisely. And it misinterprets the combo. The feeling of intending to speak sort of colors the perception of those faint sounds. And boom, the illusion of hearing an inner voice. It's kind of like the McGurk effect, you know?
Yeah.
Where seeing lips say one thing and hearing another sound makes you perceive a third sound.
Yeah.
It's a similar kind of cross-modal trick the brain plays on itself.
Wow, okay, so next time you hear that voice in your head, remember, brain trick. Linking tiny muscle twitches to background noise. A powerful illusion connecting mind and body. That's wild.
It really shows how deeply our inner mental world is tied to our physical body and, the world around us. And that connection goes even further when we talk about consciously externalizing thought.
Right, this is where we deliberately use stuff outside our heads to help us think. Like taking notes or using a computer.
Exactly. That's called external cognition. It's intentional thinking out loud, but using external things, diagrams, lists, tools, whatever. And the main reason we do it, to reduce cognitive load. Our working memory, as the analysis points out, is pretty limited. We can only juggle so much in our heads at once. Externalizing takes some of the pressure off.
Like just writing down a grocery list, so you don't have to keep repeating milk, eggs, bread in your head.
Perfect example. That's reducing memory load. Or think about computational offloading using pen and paper for long division, or a calculator or a spreadsheet. It shows even abstract stuff like logic and math often rely on these external tools. And then there's annotation or cognitive tracing, highlighting a book, scribbling notes in the margins. Those are external marks that track your thinking process, help you come back to it later.
So it's all connected then, from a little kid muttering instructions, private speech, all the way to a scientist using complex software, external cognition. It's all the mind kind of reaching out, using the external world as an extension of itself to process information.
That's a great way to put it. And this ongoing inner dialogue we have as adults, our self-talk, the content of that has a huge impact on our well-being. Plato called thinking the conversation which the soul holds with herself.
Yeah, it's how we reason, plan, motivate ourselves.
And the analysis really stresses that the content of that conversation is critical. Negative self-talk, that harsh, critical inner voice, it can be absolutely debilitating.
Oh, yeah. It crushes your confidence, creates these self-fulfilling prophecies.
Totally. It's strongly linked to stress, anxiety, depression. It can trap you in this loop that feels impossible to escape, affecting everything from your self-esteem to your relationships.
But the flip side is true too, right? Positive self-talk.
Huge asset. A supportive, optimistic inner voice. That improves self-esteem, helps manage stress, boosts overall well-being. It's linked to reduced depression and anxiety symptoms, a greater sense of control, better chances of reaching your goals. It even helps manage physical pain.
So it's not fixed then. Your inner chat isn't set in stone. You can actually work on it.
Absolutely. Cultivating positive self-talk is a learnable skill. The analysis lays out some practical steps. First, awareness. Just, noticing the negative thoughts when they pop up.
Can't change what you don't notice. Makes sense.
Exactly. Second, challenge and reframe. Ask yourself, is this thought really true? Look for other ways to see the situation. Can you shift from, I just can't cope, to something like, okay, this is really stressful, but I'm handling it step by step, and this feeling will pass. Find a balanced, realistic alternative.
So it's not about forcing fake positivity, but more about an honest check-in and finding a constructive angle.
Right. And third, practice. It takes consistent effort. Try to focus on your strengths, learn to actually accept a compliment, maybe spend time with supportive people.
So the takeaway for you listening is that inner conversation you're having, those tools you internalize from the world around you, they're not neutral. They are actively shaping your reality, building you up, or potentially tearing you down.
Which leads us perfectly into the next big piece. How does this externalizing thought build bridges? Bridges between our private minds and the huge shared reality we all live in. Philosophers, they've wrestled with this for ages. The relationship between language, thought, reality. Is language just a container for thoughts we already have? Or is language actually essential for certain kinds of thought?
Right, like the idea that maybe you can't easily think certain complex things, you don't have the words or concepts for them.
Precisely. And Ludwig Wittgenstein, a super influential philosopher, had this really radical take. He argued that a word's meaning isn't just about pointing to a thing. Meaning comes from its use, how it functions within specific contexts of human activity, what he called language games.
like shouting slab on a building site.
Right.
It doesn't mean the dictionary definition of slab. In that game, it means, hey, bring me a slab. It's an action.
Exactly. Language is a social practice, a toolkit for doing things. So when we talk, we're not just reporting on our inner state. We're making a move in a shared game with public rules. And Wittgenstein argued pretty convincingly against the idea of a truly private language, meaning, he thought, needs a public shared standard to even make sense.
This loops right back to Vygotsky.
Gah.
Thought needs that public social grounding to function properly.
They connect beautifully, yeah. And building on that, the philosopher John Searle developed his theory of speech acts. He argued that language is a form of action. When you say something, you're not just making sounds, you're performing an illocutionary act.
Okay, illocutionary act. Break that down for me. What's that mean practically?
It means the words themselves do the action. Saying, I promise I'll pay you back, is the act of making a promise. Saying, I order you to leave, is the act of giving an order. And, in the right setting, like a wedding, saying, I now pronounce you husband and wife, is the act of declaring a new social status. It actually changes reality for those people.
That's incredible. So we're not just describing the world with words, we're actively creating and changing reality through language.
Exactly. Searle connected this back to our mental states. A belief aims at being true, right? An intention aims at being carried out. Language, through these speech acts, is how our private intentions and beliefs get translated into public actions and shared understandings. The analysis really emphasizes this. Communication's power comes from this performative nature. It's the engine driving social construction. The science of thinking out loud shows how humans literally speak their shared world into existence.
Wow. Okay. We use words to build the world we live in, not just point at things in it.
But this amazing power has limits. How do we actually express pure subjective experience, that feeling of what it's like? This brings us to what philosopher David Chalmers famously called the hard problem of consciousness. Why do physical brain processes feel like anything at all from the inside?
And that what it's like feeling, that's qualia, right?
Right. The private, qualitative character of experience. The redness of red, the taste of coffee, the feeling of pain.
And these qualia, they have features that make them super hard to share.
Yeah. They're private only. You directly experience your feeling of red. They're ineffable. It's really hard to put into words exactly what red feels like, and they're immediately apprehensible. You just know it directly when you experience it.
So there's this basic gap. Language is public, symbolic, kind of digital. Experience is private, qualitative, analog. The word red is just a symbol. It's not the experience of red.
The analysis brings up the classic Mary's room thought experiment here. Mary knows every single physical fact about color vision, but she's lived her whole life in a black and white room. When she finally walks out and sees a red apple for the first time, she learns something fundamentally new. She learns what it's like to see red. That subjective, qualitative knowledge wasn't in the physical facts alone.
Man, this gap explains so much, doesn't it? Like why misunderstandings happen even when we use the exact same words. Why empathy can be so difficult sometimes.
It really does. And it highlights why things like art, music, poetry are so important. They often seem to be trying to communicate something about qualia more directly, getting around the limits of just descriptive language. It definitely raises a big question for you listening. How much just gets lost in translation when you try to share your deepest feelings, your rawest experiences, using only words?
That's a heavy thought. And so scaling up from the individual mind and language, the analysis zooms out again to show how this collective thinking out loud builds our shared reality itself, the whole social matrix.
Yeah, this is the core idea of social constructionism. Folks like Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman really lay this out. Their argument basically is that society isn't just a collection of natural facts. It's a human product. Our understanding of reality, our institutions like marriage or money, our shared meanings, our norms, it's all socially constructed.
So things like governments or economies, they aren't just there like mountains are there. We kind of invented them and agreed they were real.
Exactly. And this construction happens through this ongoing cycle, this dialectic. First, externalization. We create concepts, ideas, rules, and we put them out there through language and actions. Then, objectivation. These creations start to feel like objective facts. They take on a life of their own, seem like they've always been there for the next generation. Institutions form.
They feel solid like gravity or something?
Kind of, yeah. But their reality is social, not physical. And finally, internalization, where individuals learn these objective-seeming rules and meanings through socialization.
Which brings us right back to Vygotsky's idea, but on a huge societal scale.
Precisely, the macro version of internalizing social speech. And language is the absolute bedrock of this whole process. It's the storage container for all our shared meanings, and it's the main tool for passing that reality down through generations. Words don't just describe social reality, they actively shape it. Think about how we define crime versus illness. Huge consequences flow from those labels. Society is constantly thinking out loud its own rules, its own norms, its own meanings.
Okay, so if reality is constructed like this, how do these constructions spread? How do ideas flow? That gets into communication models, network stuff.
Yeah, the analysis touches on how our models of communication have evolved. You start with really simple linear models like Shannon Weaver, just send her messages on a receiver. Useful for engineering, maybe, but way too simple for human chat.
Right. Ignores feedback, context, all that.
Totally. Then you get interactive models, which add feedback. Makes it a two-way street. Better, but still kind of focused on just swapping messages. The model that really fits social construction is the transactional model.
Where communication isn't just sending reality. It's actively creating it together.
You got it. Participants are simultaneously sending and receiving, co-creating meaning, relationships, shared reality, all in this dynamic flow. This model captures that world-building power of talking to each other. The analysis traces this shift in thinking, from simple sending to complex reality making.
And how well ideas spread depends on the network itself, right? Not just the idea.
Network theory definitely shows that. An idea's success often depends less on its inherent quality and more on the structure of the network it moves through, how connected people are, the diversity of those connections.
And actor network theory adds another layer. It includes non-human actors.
Exactly. And this is super important today. Non-human actors like, say, social media algorithms. The analysis points out these platforms aren't just neutral pipes for information. Their algorithms actively participate. They shape what you see, who you connect with. They influence the flow of collective thinking out loud.
That's huge. Think about it. How do the algorithms on the platforms you use shape the shared reality you experience? They're not just delivering stuff, they're curating the conversation.
Absolutely. And maybe the oldest, most powerful form of this collective thinking out loud is just storytelling. Humans are fundamentally narrative creatures, right? We make sense of our lives, the world, everything through stories.
And stories are key for social cohesion, holding groups together.
Totally. They transmit history, values, cultural norms, give everyone a common framework. They build collective identity, that feeling of us, belonging to a group with a shared story. They foster empathy, letting us step into someone else's shoes, even if just imaginatively. And they help groups process shared experiences, especially tough ones like trauma. Finding a narrative helps make sense of it.
So from family stories around the dinner table to grand national myths, collective storytelling is how a group thinks out loud, its own existence, its values, its identity. It's not fixed. It's this living tapestry woven from words.
Which brings us, maybe inevitably, to the fractured side of the dialogue. The same power that builds cohesion can also create conflict, bias, deep divisions.
Yeah, the classic us versus them dynamic. Where does that come from?
The analysis digs into the psychological roots. Social identity theory, or SIP, is a big one. It explains how we get part of our self-esteem from the groups we belong to. We categorize people, including ourselves. We identify with our in-group. And then we tend to compare our group favorably to out-groups to feel better about ourselves.
And this happens even if the groups are totally random, right? Like those experiments where they split people based on flipping a coin. Bias shows up immediately. Conflict isn't even needed.
Correct. It's surprisingly easy to trigger. And then there's terror management theory, TMT, which adds this deep existential layer. We humans are sort of unique in knowing we're going to die, and that awareness can create this underlying terror. We manage it, the theory goes, by investing heavily in our cultural worldviews, our beliefs, our nation, our religion, because they offer meaning and a sense of symbolic immortality, like being part of something bigger that lasts.
And the scary part is, when we're reminded of death, what they call mortality salience, we cling harder to those worldviews.
Exactly. We show more favoritism towards people who share our worldview and more hostility towards those who challenge it, because they seem to threaten our shield against that existential dread.
Okay, let me see if I've got this. SAT gives us the basic mental boxes for us and them. And TMT pours in the high-stakes emotional fuel. Defending us and attacking them feels vital because it's tied to managing our deepest fears about death.
That's a really good summary. The analysis shows how these two theories work together, creating this powerful psychological engine that drives bias, prejudice, and often outright conflict.
And sociology looks at how this plays out structurally, in terms of power.
Right. Conflict theory, drawing from people like Marx, sees society fundamentally as a struggle for scarce resources and power. And in this view, the dominant thinking out loud, the laws, the media narratives, the accepted norms often reflects the ideology of the ruling class, designed to keep them in power. Language itself and the legal system built on it can become tools of oppression. How we define deviance or crime, for example, often serves the interests of the powerful.
Like the classic example of how society might treat, say, massive corporate fraud versus petty theft, reflects who gets to write the rules.
Precisely. The law isn't always some pure objective justice. It can be the thinking out loud of the powerful shaping reality to their advantage. And when you deliberately manipulate these psychological drivers and power dynamics, that's when you get the weaponization of narrative, propaganda, and disinformation.
So intentional systematic efforts to sway people, usually by playing on emotions, fears, biases.
Yeah. The analysis goes through some classic techniques: name-calling, dehumanization, fear-mongering, bandwagon effects, using emotionally loaded language, and it gives some really stark case studies.
Like Nazi Germany's relentless media campaign to dehumanize Jewish people, which obviously laid the groundwork for the Holocaust.
Or the Rwandan genocide, where radio stations literally broadcast hate speech, directly inciting violence among neighbors.
And even today, in modern conflicts, you see media bias, selective reporting, all aimed at shaping public perception and justifying actions.
These are chilling reminders of how collective thinking out loud, when twisted and weaponized, can fuel mass violence. It exploits those deep biases, that in-group favoritism, that worldview defense we talked about. It really makes you ask, how aware are you of these techniques being used in the information you encounter every day?
That is, a sobering question. Okay, so if society builds its rules through this collective process, why do people break them? What's the psychology of noncompliance?
Well, it's complex. It's not just people being bad. The analysis points to a mix of factors. Personality traits can play a role, things like impulsivity, maybe low conscientiousness, sensation-seeking. Your environment matters too, inconsistent enforcement of rules, or maybe rebellion is normalized among your peers. Peer pressure is huge. Cultural factors weigh in, think individualism versus collectivism. And psychological factors, sometimes rule-breaking is a coping mechanism or related to mental health struggles, or it's that feeling of reactance, pushing back when you feel your freedom is threatened.
And sometimes it feels like a conscious calculation, right? Is the benefit of breaking this rule worth the risk?
Absolutely. There's often this cognitive conflict to follow the rule or pursue my self-interest. And connecting back to what we said earlier, if rules are these socially constructed narratives, and if some groups feel those narratives are unfair, illegitimate, unjust, then the psychological win of defying them can feel more important than the potential punishment.
So in a way, widespread rule-breaking could be seen as a form of collective thinking out loud that's challenging the status quo. It's like saying, this rule, this part of the shared reality, isn't working for us anymore.
That's a fascinating way to frame it, which leads us straight into the ethical minefield. If our communication literally builds reality, how do we do it responsibly?
This is where communicative ethics comes in, right? Guiding principles.
Exactly. The analysis mentions core principles, like those from the National Communication Association. Things like truthfulness, accuracy, honesty. They're fundamental. Freedom of expression, valuing diverse perspectives, also vital. Respect for others, which means condemning speech that degrades or dehumanizes people. And taking responsibility for the consequences of our words. Intentions matter, but so does impact.
Okay, but these principles immediately run into tension, especially around free speech versus preventing harm.
Oh, absolutely. That's a central dilemma. Free speech is crucial for democracy, for challenging power, but it's not absolute. No legal system protects speech that directly incites violence, defamation, or, obscenity.
And hate speech. That's a really tough area, especially comparing different countries.
It really is. Speech that attacks or vilifies groups based on race, religion, identity. There's often a big gap between what's legally allowed in some places like the U.S., where a lot of hate speech is protected, unless it's a direct threat.
Right.
And what seems ethically okay from the standpoint of basic human dignity and respect, it raises that deep philosophical question: should the government decide which ideas are acceptable? Where do you draw the line?
And the internet just throws gasoline on that fire, doesn't it?
massively. The
Yeah.
internet is borderless, right? So national laws are hard to apply consistently. And the analysis points out something huge. Private tech companies, Meta, Google, X, formerly Twitter, they've become the de facto global speech police. They set community standards that govern billions of users' speech, often without the transparency or accountability we'd expect from a government. It's like the public square is being governed privately.
And content moderation is just a nightmare, trying to balance protecting expression with removing genuinely harmful stuff like extremism or dangerous misinformation.
Exactly. Polls often show the public wants harmful stuff removed, but then people worry about censorship, about who decides what's harmful. And the sheer volume of content is just staggering. How do you even apply ethical frameworks consistently?
If you look at it through different ethical lenses, consequentialism might say, regulate the speech that causes the most harm. Deontology might say, platforms have a moral duty not to host hate speech because it violates respect.
Right. And virtue ethics would focus more on cultivating better online behavior, encouraging empathy, respect, critical thinking skills in users themselves. But the analysis brings up a really helpful distinction here, one gaining traction: the difference between freedom of speech and freedom of reach.
Ooh, okay. Tell me more about that difference.
Freedom of speech is your basic right to say something, to express your idea. Freedom of reach is about how widely that speech is spread, often by algorithms. Who does the platform show your speech to? The suggestion is maybe the regulatory focus shouldn't be solely on censoring individual speech, but more on the platform architecture, the algorithms that amplify certain kinds of content, especially harmful content, to millions. Protect the right to speak, maybe, but not necessarily the right to have harmful speech algorithmically boosted.
Okay, now that is really interesting. How should we collectively decide who gets to speak versus who gets heard in this massive digital town square you live in every day? That speech versus reach distinction, that feels like a really useful tool for thinking about that.
It really does. And moving from grappling with these tough problems, the final part of the analysis actually looks forward. How can we apply this science of thinking out loud to, engineer a better world?
Okay, like how can we use this understanding to improve how we choose leaders? What would a proper human culture for electing leaders look like based on this?
Well, the analysis contrasts some classic ideas. You've got Plato's notion of philosopher kings rule by the wise experts who aim for the public good. Smart, maybe, but totally undemocratic, right?
Yep.
Elitist. Then you have democratic leadership models valuing participation, inclusion. These can boost creativity, morale. But they can also be slow, messy, and fail if communication totally breaks down or leaders are just unskilled.
So the science points towards a blend,
Yeah.
a synthesis.
Yeah, the idea presented is something like a democratic steward of knowledge. A leader needs not just the wisdom and expertise Plato valued, but also genuine communicative competence, the ability to engage people, unify them, facilitate that collective thinking process effectively. So the analysis suggests a framework for us as citizens to evaluate candidates based on this.
Okay, like, do they actually show expertise and wisdom? Are their plans based on evidence? Do they think long-term? Or is it all just slogans and personal attacks?
Exactly. What about their communicative style? Is it engaging, transparent? Does it bring people together? Or is it aggressive, divisive, shutting down dialogue? And critically, do they show cultural intelligence? Can they understand and relate to diverse groups within the society? Or do they rely on stereotypes and us versus them rhetoric?
So the proper culture for electing leaders isn't just about policies. It's about citizens actively thinking out loud about the candidates using this kind of framework, analyzing how they communicate, their apparent wisdom, their competence to actually steward complex collective decisions, not just what they promise.
That's the idea. And applying this science isn't just for politics. It extends to tackling huge global challenges, like, say, climate change.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Yeah.
It's long-term, it feels abstract, it asks for short-term sacrifices.
And it runs right into those cognitive biases we talked about. Our focus on the short term, our tendency to underestimate gradual threats. The science is clear. Just giving people more information about climate change isn't enough to make them change their behavior.
Right. Information alone doesn't magically flip a switch to action.
Nope. The solution needs evidence-based communication that directly targets behavior. We need to make sustainable choices easier, more visible, more socially rewarding. The analysis highlights an approach called community-based social marketing, or CBSM.
Okay, CBSM. A structured way to change specific behaviors within a community.
Exactly. You pick a specific behavior you want to change, like reducing household food waste, maybe. Then you identify the real barriers people face and the potential benefits they see. Then you design interventions using proven behavioral tools, and you measure if it actually worked. The analysis mentions a whole toolkit of strategies based on research, using simple prompts like signs reminding people to turn off lights, leveraging social norms showing people that their neighbors are already composting, for instance, getting people to make public commitments or pledges, providing feedback on their own behavior, like showing them their energy savings, making sustainable options more convenient, or using nudges to gently steer choices, and using storytelling or experiential methods to build that crucial emotional connection to the issue.
Wow. So that's really moving beyond just thinking out loud about the problem of climate change and actually using the science of communication to behavior to actively design interventions that help build a more sustainable reality.
That's exactly it. And finally, the analysis looked at using the science to bridge divides, moving from conflict to cohesion, finding pathways to reconciliation.
Because conflict is so often fueled by those dehumanizing stories and just communication totally breaking down. So reconciliation must involve rehumanizing stories and building trust through dialogue.
Precisely. We can actively work to improve the quality of our collective discourse. The analysis mentions things like Toulmin's model of argumentation, focusing on claims backed by data and warrants, which pushes us towards more evidence-based discussion, less just sharing past each other.
And game theory has insights too, like the prisoner's dilemma.
Yeah, the prisoner's dilemma shows how even rational self-interest can lead to bad outcomes for everyone involved if there's no trust. But studies of repeated prisoner's dilemma games show that strategies like tit for tat, basically, start by cooperating, then just mirror whatever the other side did last time, can actually build trust over time. It offers a practical path. Start with small, verifiable, cooperative steps to shift the dynamic from conflict to reciprocity.
Small steps building trust.
And maybe most profoundly, narrative-based healing. Creating safe spaces where people from different sides of a conflict can actually share their personal stories. Stories of suffering, yes, but also resilience.
Because hearing those personal stories, it humanizes the other, doesn't it?
Completely. It shatters stereotypes, reveals the shared humanity underneath the conflict labels, and fosters genuine empathy. It also allows individuals and groups to kind of re-author their own identities, moving beyond being just a victim or aggressor to embracing more complex, forward-looking narratives. And the simple act of telling your story and truly being listened to and listening in return, that creates a shared experience. It builds connection.
It becomes collective thinking out loud, aimed at empathy and understanding, not at winning an argument or proving the other side wrong.
Applying these tools, reasoned argument, insights from game theory, the deep power of narrative, it's about using the science of thinking out loud, not to fracture the world, but hopefully to help mend it.
So what a journey we've taken. From those private whispers in your own mind, tracing how social interaction gets internalized as thought. We wrestled with that philosophical puzzle of consciousness, how language, powerful as it is for building reality through speech acts, still struggles to capture that raw feeling of subjective experience.
We explored that vast social matrix woven by our collective talk, how communication models shape it, how stories bind us together, and then we had to face the darker side, those deep psychological roots of us versus them, how collective thinking gets weaponized in conflict, and the complex reasons why people break the very rules society constructs.
Yeah, and we navigated that ethical tightrope of communication, especially online, grappling with free speech versus harm, and that really key distinction between freedom of speech and freedom of reach.
And finally, we looked at constructive pathways forward, applying this science to engineer a better world, from choosing leaders more wisely, to using evidence-based communication for planetary health, to using dialogue and narrative to heal divisions and foster reconciliation.
This deep dive really hammered home that human reality, from your own individual psychology right up to our global civilization, it isn't some static thing you just exist inside. It's a dynamic process. It's under construction, constantly being built and rebuilt.
And the primary tool for that construction, the very architecture of our shared reality, is communication. It's our incredible, uniquely human capacity for externalized thought, for thinking out loud together.
And by understanding the science behind all this, you listening,
Yeah.
you shift from being maybe an unconscious participant in this whole reality building project to being a more conscious architect. Your thoughts, your words, how you choose to communicate, they aren't just expressing what's inside. They're active tools. They matter. You are actively participating right now in shaping the world you live in.
And maybe here's a final provocative thought for you to chew on as you go about your day. If our shared social reality is truly woven from words, from communication, and if non-human actors like those social media algorithms are now deeply integrated into the networks we use to communicate, what does that really mean for your agency in that construction process? Are you directing your communication tools to build the reality you want? Or are those tools, in subtle ways, directing you, shaping the reality we all experience in ways we don't even fully grasp, let alone control? Something to think about as you navigate the conversations, the connections, the narratives in your own life.
This is DigitView.